Thank you so much, Johan. I mean, that sets us up perfectly. And the fact that you've owned that language at the end there of climate justice is particularly helpful. And we're going to move straight on now to our panel, because we've got Stephen Gardiner, Professor of Philosophy and Human Development at the University of Washington, Seattle, who's going to carry on responding in a way to your intervention, Johan, dealing with the planetary emergency that we have from an ethics point of view, and really thinking about how we think about this problem, particularly focused on future generations. Stephen, if I could just hand straight over to you. You've had questions in advance, all of this section have, but you don't have to stick to them entirely. I just thought it's a nice link with Rohan's introduction and particularly that closing slide. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Johan, for that excellent and stimulating talk as usual. I, of course, thoroughly agree with Johan that the intergenerational dimension here is critical to understanding the climate problem. I think it's critical in understanding how we got to where we are as well, because I think what we're seeing is a failure, a moral failure, and also an institutional failure that's being played out over a number of decades to this point and just seems to be getting worse. An essential part of that failure is, I think, that a big dimension of the climate problem is that it is genuinely intergenerational, that there are significant time lags between what we do to cause nasty effects and those effects arising to their full extent, time lags of at least decades and sometimes centuries or even thousands of years. And the current generation of decision makers, so those who tend to be older members of society, have, if you like, a mismatch of incentives going on with respect to this problem. And it looks as though we need good institutional structures to correct for that mismatch of incentives, and we currently don't have them. So part of what I was going to say here was that we often say that climate change is an ethical issue, and I think it's very widely accepted that it is, but we also often don't follow through with that initial framing of the issue when we move on to think about framings of how the problem works in detail, and also when we go on to think about solutions. Now, I've written extensively about the idea that climate change poses a severe ethical challenge that I call a perfect moral storm. And I call it a perfect moral storm by way of analogy to Sebastian Junger's famous book, A Perfect Storm, which tells this real life story, in fact, of a fishing boat caught at the intersection of a number of independently powerful storms, any one of which might be enough to sink it by itself, but when they all come together at once, the challenge becomes profound. So the sense of my analogy here is that this problem, climate change, involves the intersection of major challenges to ethical action in a setting where we're not very well equipped to deal with any one of those challenges if it came by itself, but when they all come together, again, we get a profound situation, a profound challenge. Hopefully we don't sink in the end, but we definitely need to work very hard to combat this coming together. So the major features are, and I'm not going to go into them in detail, but just signal the rough areas where they lie. The problem is genuinely global. It's seriously intergenerational, as we've already mentioned. It crosses species boundaries, and it comes in a setting where our theories and institutions are not well developed and often actually encourage bad kinds of action as well as inaction, rather than being addressed to solving the problem. And because of some of the perverse incentives that are at stake in this setting, we also see a problem that I call moral corruption. The ways in which we think and talk about the problems themselves can become influenced by the many temptations that we find for unethical action. So you might say the current generation of decision makers, especially the more powerful among them, are kind of primed to select ways of looking at the problem that disguise what's going on, really, and also disguise what the most effective solutions might be. So a few dimensions here that I think will probably be well known to people listening to this are, of course, there are what I call skewed vulnerabilities in the climate problem. Those who are most vulnerable to the impacts, at least in the short to medium term, are disproportionately those who haven't contributed much to causing the problem. And the reverse is also somewhat true. Those who have done most to cause the problem are at least less vulnerable. That creates big ethical issues. It's also true that these kinds of worries about vulnerabilities intersect badly with background injustices in the global system, some of them historical, some of them current, so that those who are already victims of certain kinds of injustice are more vulnerable than they would otherwise be to this kind of problem. And there's this huge intergenerational dimension. But I think one thing that it's worth us talking about or thinking about is the way in which we're in a kind of denial. I mean, we're all very used to talking about denial about science and the problems that causes. But I think we're also in the grip of a kind of institutional and theoretical denial, right? We haven't fully taken on board the fact that our institutions and our theoretical approaches are not well adapted to this kind of situation. So I think one of the first things we have to take on, and that the group I think should take on, it's a place where law could play a leading role, is to try and push back on that and demand that we develop institutions and policies that really confront these problems we have around institutions and theories.
Thank you very much. It's really good to make this solid connection with the science. And as you say, Stephen, there's amplification of risk. Climate change itself amplifies other societal risks and increases vulnerability. And one of the things that makes it harder for policymakers to respond to is that it was already problematic to deal with this or that problem, and climate change simply amplifies it, exaggerates differences and stresses in our society. And one of the areas where that clearly happens is in health. And we're going to turn now to Maria Neira, who is the Director of Public Health, Environment and Social Determinants of Health at the World Health Organization. And Maria has been a leading advocate on trying to establish these solid connections between public health and climate change. And so I'm going to turn to Maria now to make her contribution.
Thanks, James, and thanks the previous speakers. It's true that the panorama is, excuse me. I'm sorry, I was having a coffee before and probably was not a good one. James, do you mind? Oh, I think it's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was just a technique.
Get on.
I have your attention. No, I'm afraid not yet. James, do you mind to leave the floor to other?
Of course, Maria. Why don't I go to Laurence next? Because actually there was a nice link in the end of Stephen's remarks about institutions. And one of the things that Laurence can speak to is the adequacy of not only public international law as a doctrine, as a theory, as a practice, but also the institutions that represent and enforce and apply public international law. So let's just switch seamlessly to Laurence. Laurence, this is your subject area, teaching public international law in Geneva, and long practice and user of the courts around the world. Let's just pass to you and deal with this question of adequacy of the law and institutions.
Yeah, thanks, James. I must say that it's a pleasure to see James, because we have known each other for a long time. And I would like to pay respect to James, because he's one of the pioneers for thinking about climate change and environmental law in the early 90s. He was the one to lead the road. So thank you, James. It's a good occasion to do that. I must say that I'm going to speak with a lot of humility, because I come from a field where I don't think we're well equipped yet to deal with the issue of climate change. So after having listened to the previous speakers, I was wondering, but am I sure that law is the right instrument for facing this issue? So I was thinking that ethics was the instrument, and I think it is, but we also need there to strengthen this. So why do I say that law might not be, it's an instrument, but it's not going to be the instrument to bring an answer. And why is it so? Because I think there is a huge paradox. The scientists have been aware of the climate crisis for a long time. And we lawyers, we started really to deal with it in the early 90s, not before. And that was at the international level. At the domestic level, it has come later, in fact, in the 2000s. And when we look at, and James is an expert in that, but when we look at the content of the legislation, the law, at the domestic level, at the European level, we see that it's still very sectoral oriented, it's issue oriented. So they deal, for example, with mitigation, which is important, but we all know that mitigation is not the only answer to face the climate crisis. We need to deal with the economic system, with the tax system, with the agricultural system, and so on. So that's one first point. And I think for the generation today and for the students that are studying everywhere, there is a need to develop a new legal language to deal with the issue of climate change. Because for the time being, I think we've been addressing it with our conventional language. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point is that, and that was acknowledged by the previous speakers, is that we know much more than in the 90s. And remember that we had huge uncertainties about the impacts and so on, but we don't know everything. And and so law, you know, what is preoccupied with stability, previsibility, and so on. And in fact, when dealing with climate change, we have to integrate the component of uncertainty. We have to admit that we don't know everything, but there are things that we should not be doing. And for that too, I don't think that law is yet well equipped. So we have made some progress. I think the precautionary principle has strengthened, has been acknowledged in constitutions and so on. Before courts and tribunals, we now have experts, cross-examination and so on. But the question for us is that, is it really the only tool for addressing uncertainty? And the third point is in relation to the strengthening of certain concepts. And James started with this. And then Stephen Gardiner did so. Justice, what does it mean, justice? Do we really know what it means in climate change terms? And we now are focusing on the notion of intergenerational equity, but James was mentioning the role of institutions. It's quite interesting to see that we don't yet have institutions to support this idea of intergenerational equity. We have ombudsmen for human rights, for participatory rights, but we don't yet have a voice in the legal systems for speaking on behalf of the future generations and so on. So all that is to say that I think that the law is still in its infancy and we still have to develop it. But I'm not so sure that law is going to be the instrument for addressing all these issues. Thank you.
Oh, bravo, that was really, really helpful. And we'll return to a couple of these points before we finish the panel. Really interested in the language point, how we use the language of the law. Might want to come back also to whether we should be looking at particular courts and tribunals to become expert at this. You know, I've talked to our mutual friend Philippe Sands about the Permanent Court of International Arbitration, you know, a tribunal that's used to dealing with public and private actors. Maybe could develop a specialist tribunal there. And also this notion of how we take a principle that I worked on quite a lot, precaution, and make it effective in legal doctrine. So we'll come back to that, but now let's see whether Maria is fit and well and able to contribute her ideas on public health as well. Maria, over to you.
Thank you, and apologies. It was just a technique to make sure that everybody will realize how important health is to be able to participate, you know. Thank you for that. I mean, the arguments we were hearing until now are absolutely devastating. I mean, there is a planetary emergency, but I could take all of the slides of Johan and translate it into the health map, and the picture that will result of that will be devastating as well. So it's not just a planetary emergency, it's a health, global health emergency, the one we are confronting at the moment. I mean, we know very well that only the fact that we are burning fossil fuels is partially responsible for those 7 million premature deaths that we have every year. So I think that will be an enormous argument to start to talk, as Laurence was saying, changing maybe the narrative, the dialogue, I mean, the words we are using to tell people about climate change. Maybe now that they are very much concerned about the health vulnerability, we can talk in positive and say, we know how to reduce health vulnerability. And the most important way to do it will be by tackling the causes of climate change, resulting in a reduction of air pollution and protecting much more our health. And one of those clear interventions will be stop using fossil fuels that are literally killing us, literally. Some time ago, I remember on our first global conference on climate, on air pollution and health, we were using a slogan saying air pollution is the new tobacco. And then so the tobacco campaigner says, well, you cannot compare the two things. Certainly, we cannot compare, definitely. This is much worse. But we have been able on the tobacco front, even if it took 50 years and it was horrible and difficult and still not very ambitious, we have a framework convention on tobacco. Maybe we need a similar legal tool to make sure that countries will oblige to endorse at least the WHO standards related to air quality. That will be something in the name of health that I think it will be even more justifiable than the tobacco convention, because it's not behavioral, it's not something that it will depend on my choice, it's something that I need to breathe no matter what. And it's something that in any case will generate enormous benefit, not only for health, but we all know the connections and the interconnections. So this cooperation with the legal, with the enforcement of the existing legislation or creating new legislation, for us is a fantastic tool that needs to be explored. I think we need to make sure that people understand, and I have a question for you, the legal people. What are how legal is to breathe toxic air? I mean, as a citizen, can I go to a tribunal and say, you are exposing me voluntarily to levels of air that I cannot avoid breathing that are incompatible with human life? It was a very anecdotal case in Paris, I think, where a tribunal refused to send back an immigrant from Bangladesh with the argument that this person was asthmatic, so he couldn't go back for health reasons to Dhaka because the air was totally polluted. So my question is, what are the limits for the legal rights that we have in terms of keep breathing those toxic air that is literally killing us? And how far are we of maybe a treaty or a legislation telling us, well, fossil fuels should be banned, particularly when we have other options and we can move to different sources of energy. So I think we need to put all of our forces, but on providing very positive responses to our citizens. This generation needs to try to address this horrible lack of justice for the new generation by at least using all the tools that we have. And law can be a powerful, positive, reasonable for a society that is trying to protect and to reduce as well the vulnerability that we all know as well, the economic crisis that might cause as well. So maybe it's not the new tobacco, it's even much worse, but it has to be the tobacco for which we will put in place all the tools that are available, and we will do it in a very ambitious way. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And let's just stay with you a moment. So go back around the other way, as it were. Clearly, during the COVID crisis, we've seen the connection between public health and indeed climate and air pollution, something you have looked at very closely. There's also obvious manifest unfairness in where the problem has landed, which sort of mirrors the climate change problem within countries, within cities even. Look at the difference between an impoverished part of a city. Where are the temperatures highest? Where's the green space? Where's the air pollution highest? Where's the highest incidence of asthma, et cetera, et cetera? Could you just deal with that a little bit more? So, because this might be a place where the legal system can react with either new legislation or better enforcement of existing legislation. We have an example here in the City of London that colleagues involved with this event have been involved with the so-called LL case. You could just address that for us for a moment.
Yeah, we live in a world where more than 90% of the global population is breathing air that is not respecting the proposed standards of air quality proposed by WHO. That is already a fact. So that will be already, and our standards are very reasonable. So we are not proposing, to breathe the pure air of the mountains in Switzerland. We are talking about quality of air that will be reducing that terrible mortality. Obviously, for those citizens that have been for a long period of time been breathing and exposed to that polluted air, their lungs are much more vulnerable. So when you have an infectious agent like the COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, of course, that will be much more vulnerable to develop the disease. And when they develop the disease, they will develop it in a more severe way. And not only that, all of pre-existing medical conditions which are associated with exposure to air pollution will be perfect factors that will facilitate for you to develop the disease. And if you are poor, of course, other elements will be added. So this issue of injustice and the inequalities is very, very clear. You can draw the map of air pollution, very polluted areas, and you have the map of inequities, and you have the map of poverty. And of course, climate change will come here on the use of those polluting fuels that will add it. And as you say, it's an accelerator of all the basic pillars of our health will be very much access to food, access to water, access to shelter, and quality of air. All of those pillars with climate change and air pollution will be very much unstable and can even collapse if we keep insisting on destroying nature.
Okay, marvelous. Let's just go back around and sort of reverse order and get to Laurence now, because you actually asked us a general question for a response from the legal community, and I'm sure Laurence has got some views. But it's really a question of how best to respond. I mean, if our institutions and our legal order is inadequate to date, where do you see possibilities to either push what's already there, create new courses of action, better enforce things that are already there? How would you respond to the challenges, as it were, that Maria's put forward, Laurence? What occurs to you?
Thanks, James. I just want to bring some insight, some positivism insight, some optimism, because I think we also have to rely on this to be able to do something. And I know that Lavanya Rajmani is going to speak later on, but I'd like to bring back at the fore the Paris Agreement, because I think the Paris Agreement on climate change is a major achievement. And the Paris Agreement was adopted together with a decision of the contracting parties. And when you look at these two instruments together, I think you have the architecture for the world. Now, we're speaking of a global issue. That means that it should be dealt with by all countries of the world. Now, we all know that there are a lot of disparities among the countries and so on. So what I was thinking when, listening to that is that why not taking the Paris Agreement as a sort of constitution? And we know that constitutions are not well specified, well developed. They are general principles, and then they are developed further by other instruments. And there, I think that the WHO has a major role to play for complementing the understanding of some of the provisions of the Paris Agreement. Then the other points I'd like to make, and Lavanya will come back to that, is that it's quite interesting to see that courts, national courts, have now taken the Paris Agreement on board and have told states, look, you have committed to something and you should go give meaning to something. So I think that there is a virtue of this constitution at the world order. The last comment I'd like to make about the Paris Agreement and the importance of the Paris Agreement is that it is built on trust. Okay, and I think it's quite interesting because we lawyers, I don't think we know yet what is trust. We've not yet defined it. So how did we define it? Through the Paris Agreement, we define it through transparency. If we know what the others are doing, there will be trust. I'm not so sure that it's sufficient. And maybe that's one of the next challenges, is to build this trust, but how to build it, that's going to be, I think, the topic of the discussion of this conference. Thanks.
Well, it is, isn't it? I mean, we do have to build that trust, and there is an intergenerational trust issue that has to be looked at, and the way we make decisions, who's in the room when they make decisions, is critical. But I do like, and I acknowledge, I'm sure Lavanya will pick it up with the fact that the Paris Agreement is increasingly being referred to in domestic tribunals, particularly in constitutional courts, and some kind of practice is emerging. All right, so let's go back to where we began with Stephen. And I wonder, Stephen, if we could perhaps address again, because it is so vital to what follows, but certainly you will see towards the end of today's program, a very particular intervention on this theme, which is the responsibility between generations. First of all, as a matter of theory, what responsibilities do current generations have to protecting future generations? And then perhaps any suggestions that you might have of how would we put this into practice? So clearly we have constitutional rights which pick this up to some extent, and some of the cases have so far have fastened upon that issue. But I wonder whether I could leave with you the question of how best to give expression to the intergenerational equity, fairness, and justice point.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the other panelists. This is a very interesting discussion. I think I would start by saying that for me, I think of the intergenerational problem as, if you like, a distinctive kind of collective action problem that plays out over time and involves multiple generations. And I call this collective action problem the tyranny of the contemporary, where each successive generation can engage in practices that provide perhaps only modest benefits for it, but impose severe harms or costs on future generations. And if every generation does that, or enough of them do, that creates very nasty outcomes in the future. And I think in thinking about international, indeed national contexts and environmental contexts, we spent a lot of time thinking about a different kind of collective action problem, the tragedy of the commons. But in fact, I think the tyranny of the contemporary is a more serious problem and captures a lot of the issues we're facing now. I think we need to confront that directly with institutions and norms, and so far we haven't done that. I think we face a governance gap when it comes to dealing with future generations. And I think that filling that gap should be focused on addressing this problem of the tyranny of the contemporary. Unfortunately, with apologies to Laurence, I don't think that the Paris Agreement does a very effective job there. I think you know, it makes some modest improvements, but it's more continuous with the Kyoto Agreement, which is widely viewed as a failure at this point than people like to admit. I'm a bit skeptical of voluntary trust-based approaches at the international level in the face of the kind of threat that Johan was telling us about. It seems a kind of anarchist approach politically, and we're not big fans of anarchism in general, so why we would adopt it for a global intergenerational problem, I'm not sure. I think we need a more serious kind of governance. So I've been proposing, you know, on the more concrete terms, I've been proposing that what we need is what I call a global constitutional convention for future generations, where we put together a body that very seriously considers what kinds of governance intervention we need that might, you know, seriously address the problems we face, and how to integrate those possibly new institutions with the institutions we already have. Of course, the obvious objections are going to be around feasibility, and I have quite a lot to say about that. And I think the feasibility problems are not quite as bad as people tend to think. But I also think that it is the kind of solution we're going to need regardless. So we better find a way of making either the Global Constitutional Convention or something relevantly like it feasible if we're going to solve these problems. And then at a more particular level, I think we need some conceptual change and evolution. I've been interested in the notion of planetary health, and so I'd be interested in what Maria and Laurence think about that. And I've also been working with people at the Potsdam Institute on concrete proposals like for Nansen-style passports for climate refugees. And I think all of these areas are areas where input from, you know, practicing legal professionals and legal theorists would be very important, because these are areas where the legal world has a lot of experience with related problems, and including experience in seeing where existing paradigms, concepts, and institutions are inadequate for the purpose. One very brief final comment. I think we do need to develop more intergenerational norms, but I also think we should be careful about making the floor too low for those norms. I realize it's popular to say we should at least pass on, you know, what we inherited in the current generation. And I agree with that, but I think we probably should be more ambitious, and common sense morality suggests we want to be more ambitious. We want to pass on a future that's better than what we inherited. And I wouldn't like to see that norm disappear too quickly. Thank you.
Okay, so look, we would have a longer discussion about how to interpret the Paris Agreement. I think it has more effect than perhaps you do, but that's mostly picked up in domestic legislation, which is, after all, the intent in order to be able to get a universal agreement. And I would suggest that, although I do really like the idea of a global constitutional convention, I think you would have the same challenges to get alignment, and be very difficult to make that universal. You might be able to get a plurilateral agreement or a smaller agreement amongst a smaller group of countries. But I do agree very much that these international agreements, and then Laurence picks this up too in what her remarks, are effectively constitutional agreements. And they have to be general in order to be able to get the widest participation. It's after that that you look for more specificity, you look for greater degrees of enforcement. And actually, when you just checking the very brilliant questions that come in that we have very little time to properly deal with, many of them fasten on this question of voluntary versus the stricter, legally binding, more directly enforceable rights and duties. The difficulty of finding principles that are both effective from a scientific point of view and from a legal point of view. And we touched, Laurence, on the precautionary principle, which is a classic example of that. And also a certain amount of skepticism, or maybe a sort of jaundiced view of the capacity of even good law to be enforced by governmental institutions that may not have, to use your phrase, Stephen, a contemporary interest in enforcing them because it might be against their more immediate political interests. Without being able to cover every single angle of all those questions, could I just ask you to visit those themes in your concluding remarks? And if I may start with Laurence, because you seem to have been placed in the middle of these other experts as the representative of the legal profession. If you could pick up some of these very good questions about voluntary versus mandatory, enforceability versus general principle. And yes, please, Laurence, to you.
I'm not, you know, I think those are fair points. Those are fair points. But I'd say that I come from, as James said, from the international law world, and we are going through a crisis in terms of implementation. We're going through a phase of treaty fatigue and so on. So I think that we should at least keep what we have and strengthen what we have. Now, the voluntary commitments, I think that if you look carefully at the Paris Agreement, they are procedural safeguards. And once you've committed, you're committed to do always more. That's the progression principle. And I think that this one is an interesting tool. Now, looking at one recent decision of French courts or German courts, they are now looking at the objective of the Paris Agreement and saying, this is a commitment. So I think there are potentialities that we should explore. And I'm quite impressed with the creativity of the people bringing these cases before domestic courts. And I think we need creativity. That's what is important. So maybe the ideas of Stephen could find ways through these passes of creativity, and we could reach what I think is important, this idea of preserving the rights of the future generations. So let's be creative and let's be willing to do something on the ground. Thanks.
Very good. And I do, the materials that came with this event were nicely prepared by Bickel and other experts. You do show a body of law emerging that refers to the Paris Agreement, is situated in domestic constitutions of some note and power, and that becomes the basis of future practice too. Okay, Maria, do feel free to respond to any of the other questions that keep coming in if you could see them, but perhaps over to you about, just to offer some conclusion from your point of view, this vital connection between public health, climate, and the law, and the protection of the rights of those most unfairly affected by, in particular, air pollution.
Yeah. Thanks, James. We are about to attend the COP26, which is in reality COP27. But you know what that means? It means that for 27 years we have been negotiating. Don't forget that. So imagine how long it will take now to initiate another convention. At least we will be at COP50 and we will still be negotiating a comma or a paragraph. So time is over for all of that. I think we need something in putting together public health, putting together the generational justice, and putting together the sustainability and the reduction of vulnerability that we need after this horrible crisis. We need to agree on something extremely simple, things that people can, the society can put pressure on their governments for the implementation, and maybe as simple as ensure a healthy energy transition, stop using fossil fuels, ensure a healthy urban transition, and ensure a healthy food system transition. And all of that accompanied by a minimum of legislation or I mean, laws and rules, and particularly visualizing if you don't go with the right speed and the right level of ambition, look at what you are doing to your health. How many lives are you non-protecting, or I mean, how many people you are killing, if you want me to put it so horribly, or how many, I mean, what the destruction you are creating on the planet. I think it has to be, after all of this rhetoric and all the arguments that are massive now, we need to, somebody has to take the leadership and then proposing extremely simple measures that the society can implement and watch their governments to implement it as well.
Nicely put. Now, Stephen, last word lies with you before we go to Lavanya, who's going to give us her view on climate litigation. It seems to me that one of the ways things can go slow, quick, is when there's a fundamental change of consciousness. When something that seemed perfectly acceptable in a generation before becomes completely unacceptable, and it can happen very fast. It's happened with same-sex marriage in places like Ireland, where you know, tradition and the role of the church was set aside really quickly when eventually that movement managed to connect. And indeed, some of the cases we've seen so far, Ireland being another good example, where there's a constitutional court decision and immediately a change in politics. And that has, you know, produced a rapid shift after a long, slow build-up. Is that something that we could really focus on from a theoretical, intellectual point of view? How do you shift consciousness? How do you change consciousness? Steve.
Well, that's a great question. I'm hopeful that can happen. I'm also hopeful that we will be ready theoretically and institutionally to move if and when that occurs. I still think, you know, we've been waiting for that for a while. Some people have been optimistic for a while that when the impacts start to get really bad, we will see such a shift. I've been a little bit worried about that, partly because I keep seeing major impacts without seeing the corresponding shift. It's become common where I live in the summer, in the late summer, to, you know, have days where you can't go outside because of the smoke from the wildfires, and that doesn't seem to have dramatically shifted how people think about this or how they vote about it. So I'm worried about that. I'm also still worried about the intergenerational angle, because I'm concerned that when things get really bad, you know, even the young will start to go for comparatively short-term fixes. So another area I work in is the Geo Engineering area. And I think there's increasing enthusiasm, if you can call it that, for radical techno fixes that are pretty risky and underdeveloped. So we have to be a little careful about when things get bad, desperation can kick in, and that can also be bad intergenerationally. We might see fixes that at best work in the short to medium term, but make things worse in the future.
Okay, well, we sadly have to bring this rather wonderful panel to a conclusion. So nice to see faces again after all these years. One of these days we might actually be able to meet face to face. That would be good. Thank you so much for your contributions. Do stay with us if you would like. There's lots of questions in the chat that I would have liked to have got to. We haven't got time, but we might follow up with later and try and answer over the next couple of days. I'll certainly look at them later. Apologies if I've missed one or two that were brilliant and I just didn't see them in time. But thank you very much, all three of you. Really appreciate your time and wonderful contributions.